Excellent. All right, we are live, bearing with somebody who's doing this for the first time. So we are 5 minutes behind and we'll get rolling. Welcome to our virtual event on domestic violence and support services during COVID-19. I am State Representative Lindsay LaPointe and I represent the 19th House District, and I am so pleased to co-host this event with Senator Martwick of the 10th Senate District. As you might know, if you live on the far northwest side or the near northwest suburbs, Senator Martwick and I are your state lawmakers. We go to Springfield and we draft and vote on state laws, but we all connect constituents to state services and we liaison with state agencies. During this very difficult time of 19, we are primarily working remotely, and our remote offices are fielding a ton of constituent questions, a lot related to accessing unemployment, Medicaid, and interpreting the directives that are coming from the governor's office. Simply put, we are here and we are very accessible to you, however, remotely. COVID-19 has changed everything for everyone. It has certainly changed the way that we govern. It's changed the way we do community events, hence this virtual event. And it's changed the way that we as a community and we as a society take care of each other and keep each other safe. And that's some of what we're going to talk about today. In normal times, this would be an in-person event, and Senator Martwick and I would have just returned from several weeks straight of regular session in Springfield. But instead, this is a virtual event that we're adapting to, and we just crammed an entire spring session into 4 days in Springfield about a week and a half ago, where we had a more limited focus, but it did include a state budget, which I'm proud to say we passed on time. Everybody is adapting to the world of the pandemic. And today we are also adapting to civil unrest and racial injustice across our entire country and here in Chicago, and that's very much front and center. No doubt where we are right now is producing a lot of anxiety for a lot of people. Our normal systems that we rely on as humans, as individuals, and as a society in terms of taking care of each other are strained and they are changing. We've been forced to change our behavior and we're adapting our service system to take care of people in the safest way given the pandemic. But part of that is making sure the public knows about how our social service systems are changing. So that's part of what we're going to talk about today, so people know what resources are out there. So not only are we going to talk about domestic violence to both educate and destigmatize, but we want to make sure that the public is aware of the adapted resources that are out there related to domestic violence in the time of COVID. So me, myself, as a former social work professional who's worked with both men and women who have faced intimate partner violence and housing instability, I know that domestic violence is a systemic issue and it requires an individual response, but also a systemic response. As a state rep, I feel confident in saying that our leaders across the state do care about this issue. And despite the extremely challenging fiscal times that we're in right now, we were able to hold the line on domestic violence funding from state fiscal year 20 to state fiscal year 21, which I consider really important and a huge win. And it means that we can maintain funding for things like our 24-hour hotlines related to domestic violence, temporary shelter and assistance into affordable housing for survivors of domestic violence, legal assistance, which we're going to hear more about today, and counseling for survivors and children. So no doubt these are some of the most challenging times that we are in, I would say, in our lifetimes, and there's so much to address. And I am thankful that at the state level, we are aware of domestic violence and we've been able to hold the line on funding. So on that note, talking about what's going on the state level, I want to turn it over to my co-host, Senator Martwick, to say a few words.
Thank you, Representative Lapointe, and thank you, Renata and Danielle, for joining us today in this important discussion. And Representative Lapointe, you brought up a very important point in this discussion. It's an interesting time, right? We're dealing with a global pandemic and civil unrest, and yet this issue of domestic violence is an issue that, it's interesting. I'm thinking of the parallels. We often hear the governor say that when he talks about the coronavirus pandemic, he talks about this as being a virus that knows no bounds, it knows no class, it knows no culture, it knows no color. It affects everyone. And in my experience, that is domestic violence. Domestic violence is a problem that pervades every aspect of our society, and it's something that we need to continue to deal with. And certainly, of course, those problems can be exacerbated in communities where they don't have the resources for it. And so I want to echo your sentiments on the budget that was just passed. Very proud of that, and the fact that it continues to fund essential services, especially services that help address problems with domestic violence in our society. But I also want to point out that as Illinois has its persistent year after year budget struggles, and certainly in the last few years where those budget struggles were front and center, domestic violence is one of those programs that address domestic violence are always seem to be on the cutting table. So it's important that we continue to fight it, because this is one of those, we can look at our society through different demographics, and different demographics face different problems, whether they are socioeconomic or racial, like we're dealing with now. But domestic violence is one of those things that touches every demographic. And so when we address that problem, it is one way, as we begin to address problems surrounding domestic violence, that we can improve the overall health of our entire community, every segment, every section of our society. And that's why it is so important. A little bit about my background. I spent my first 5 years out of law school working in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. And for 18 months of those, I was the lead prosecutor of the domestic violence prosecutions unit in the Skokie Municipal, 2nd Municipal District Courthouse in Skokie. And during that time, I would say that my 18 months in that unit was an incredible learning experience for me. I think that there's so much to learn about the patterns of violence and the cycle of violence, and how it works and how it intersects and how it affects people differently, whether it is the victim or the abuser. And during that 18 months, the learning curve was off the charts. And by the time I was done, the knowledge that I had about domestic violence after the 18 months was exponentially higher than when I'd begun. And yet it also made me aware that after 18 months of work in domestic violence, how little I actually knew. And so having things like this, where we have an opportunity to very briefly discuss these issues, hopefully give people some information they need, and most importantly, as you mentioned, Lindsay, is giving them resources so that after this brief, if they say, that might be a situation I'm in, or gee, that might be someone I know is facing those struggles, that we can point them to the resources where there are experts like Renata and Danielle who can help them with their problems. So thank you for putting this together. Thank you for having me as a panelist and a co-host. I'm very happy to once again have an opportunity to listen and learn from people who are doing such good work on the ground. So thank you for having me.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Senator Martwick. I am going to quickly turn it over to our expert guest, but I do want to let listeners know kind of what we're going to do here. We're going to hear from two amazing people who do exceptional work every day They're going to talk about domestic violence and how the service system has adapted in the time of COVID. And we're certainly going to leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions that can come in through various forms of chat that people are monitoring. So I am super enthused to introduce two people. One, Danielle Parisi Raffato, who is the Director of Emergency Services at Ascend Justice. So she is in charge of all services related to orders of protection and their walk-in clinic at Ascend Justice, which is a nonprofit that works with people and families impacted by gender-based violence and the child welfare system. And then Renata Steele, and by the way, these are both lawyers. Renata Steele runs the court advocacy program. She's the program supervisor at Metropolitan Family Services, which you might have heard of. That's a very robust nonprofit organization serving all of Chicagoland in a variety of areas like behavioral health, violence prevention, and domestic violence and court advocacy. So I'm thrilled that you are both joining us here today as experts and people on the ground doing the work. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Representative Lovepoint and Senator Martwick, for having both of us here. So to start off, I'm tasked with giving a 5-minute overview of domestic violence. And just so everyone understands how kind of hilarious that is, when new staff members join, we go to a week-long 40-hour training on domestic violence. And even that is just the tip of the iceberg. So this is very, very basic information. But so that we're all on the same page about what exactly we're talking about. We're talking about abuse that occurs at the hands of a family or household member. And I use the term abuse instead of violence because the term domestic violence sometimes leads people to believe that we're only talking about physical violence. And they're picturing somebody who has a giant black eye. And domestic violence or domestic abuse involves a lot of different forms of abusive behavior. So we definitely are talking about physical abuse, also sexual violence, also emotional and emotional verbal abuse, stalking, controlling behavior. And most often, a variety of these forms of abuse come together in a relationship. So this isn't strictly physical abuse. It involves a lot of other behaviors. Most often, sometimes domestic violence is used interchangeably with the term intimate partner violence. And most of the cases we deal with at my agency do involve intimate partners. It's someone who's being abused by a significant other, spouse, ex, someone who they have kids in common with. However, domestic violence can apply more broadly. So it can include other individuals who share a household or are family members through blood or marriage. And sometimes those situations are their own situation, and sometimes family members become involved in a situation of intimate partner violence, and there's sort of overlap, and then family members are being harassed as well. A few other important things. Domestic violence tends to follow a pattern of abusive behavior where it starts off slowly and escalates over time, and also where it tends to cycle through periods of serious abuse, reconciliation, calm, and then more abuse as time goes on. I think that is really important to think about, because one of the main questions that everyone has when they first learn about domestic violence is, why don't people leave abusive relationships? And I've literally heard the statement or the question, someone is punching you, why don't you leave them? And it is rare in my experience to see a situation where abuse gets physical quickly, very early on. What tends to happen is abuse starts as something more subtle, controlling behavior, maybe a little bit of jealousy. And then it goes through the cycle multiple times. And then over time, it tends to get progressively worse and become violent. And so we're not talking about somebody getting punched on a first date. We're talking about somebody who faces physical abuse after they've invested time in a relationship that started out very good. Also, a lot of times abuse either starts or gets significantly worse after a few things happen. When pregnancy is a huge trigger and also something that tends to increase the severity of abuse, as well as things like getting married and moving in together. And so as time goes on and two people are more strongly tied, sometimes they have a legal relationship like a lease or a marriage, they can be more, it can be more difficult to leave that relationship, and the abuse also can escalate. The last two things that I'd like to say is, as Senator Martwick mentioned, this transcends all boundaries. It occurs in every community, and we see it in our practice every day. And so this is not something that, this is something that when you talk about domestic violence, I think it's good to keep in mind that you might be talking to someone who's experienced domestic violence themselves. You might be talking to someone who grew up in a household with domestic violence, or has a close family member or friend who is a survivor or a perpetrator of domestic violence. So that is never something that, we always try to be careful to not refer to, our clients as this other group of people that is separate from us, because they very much are, include our family members and friends and community members. And then the final thing is, why do abusers abuse? What is the point of this? And abuse is, I can confidently say, a learned behavior, and it does have a goal of trying to increase power and control over the victim, to use these tactics in a way that involves the abuser to be in control of the situation. And that is why tactics like monitoring, putting someone under surveillance, controlling what they do, isolation, cutting off contact with family members and friends, can be so significant in these situations, because those are mechanisms that an abuser uses to gain power and control over the situation. Going back to why people don't leave abusive relationships, this is really a complicated issue, and there's not one thing. There's a famous law review article called 50 Reasons Why Women Don't Leave Abusive Relationships. And it gives 50 distinct reasons, and that's not all of them. But I mentioned the cycle of violence, getting trapped as the abuse continues and wanting to get back to a good place. It includes feelings like love for your abuser and fear when you are threatened, your life is threatened, or your family's life is threatened, believing those threats, and understandably so. Economic pressure, cultural pressure to stay with your spouse or the parent of your children. So that is very, very brief, but that is the shortest overview I can think of what we're talking about today. Renata?
That was great. Thank you, Danielle. And less than to add to that, I just wanted to kind of transition also to our current reality, and recognize that over the last decade or so, I think we're becoming increasingly aware of the connections that are emerging between domestic violence and community violence and gun violence. And when we talk about the different factors that impact those dynamics, I recently learned that officers accused of intimate partner violence had 50% more complaints of excessive force. And that was something that was shared by the Network Advocating Against Domestic Violence, and it came from the Citizens Police Data Project. So just to add that complexity to our current climate, when there's inequality and abuse of power, which exists in our society at large and within a domestic violence relationship, what's needed is accountability, just as we're seeing today on a national scale in our communities.
Thanks, Renata. And that is very true. And also, you mentioned community violence, gun violence, situations involving mass shootings. So often there is a link in a history involving domestic violence. So this is something that impacts all of us. So we wanted to talk for just a few minutes about, in terms of resources, what someone can do if they are in an abusive relationship and want assistance. And I will say, Renata and I are going to mention a lot of resources rather than rattling off a ton of phone numbers. We will work with Representative LaPointe and Senator Martwick to put together a list of resources that can be distributed after this event. So when someone decides to get assistance and either stay in an abusive relationship or to leave their abuser, there are a variety of things that they can do and a variety of tools that they can use. None of these are the end-all be-all perfect answer for everyone. So just so we know what we're talking about in terms of the range of available remedies, there are some legal options. One of them is to come to court and ask for an order of protection in civil court. And the purpose of that is to protect themselves and family and household members from further abuse. There is also the option of working with the police and the state's attorney to pursue criminal charges, which would involve an arrest, the state filing a case and prosecuting the abuser for a situation, an incident of abuse. And there also may be remedies that may be sought in a domestic relations case if the two people are married or have kids in common. And sometimes having, for example, a visitation arrangement that is occurs in a court order can help stop some of the controlling issues and can help make things occur smoothly. Often that's a step that someone gets to down the road. First, I want an order of protection. First, I want to establish my immediate safety. And then later on, I want to make this safe situation more permanent. There are also a ton of other forms of assistance. And so there are court advocates who work with people who need to engage in these legal remedies and assist them with the process and connect them with resources. There's safety planning, which is a fancy word for sitting down with somebody and practically working through the steps that they can take to try to keep themselves safe. Things like shelters, which everyone kind of thinks of, like immediate safety needs, counseling, support in the form of money, but also and rent assistance, but also, food, clothing, furniture. There are resources for all of these things. And again, none of these are mutually exclusive. A lot of times our clients need an order of protection, and also they need help finding an apartment and a visit to the Chicago Furniture Bank. That's just the reality we're working in terms of trying to work on all of the different issues that our clients are facing to help them achieve safety. So in terms of what, and so now we're going to dive in a little bit to the resources that exist. And so I work at Ascend Justice, and as Representative LaPointe mentioned, we serve clients who are impacted by gender-based violence and the child welfare system. And so we have our emergency services division, which I head up, where we work on civil orders of protection. Typically, we have a walk-in clinic at 555 West Harrison, which is the Cook County Centralized Domestic Violence Courthouse, where we have clients walk in and we provide brief services, paperwork preparation, legal advice, information, so that they can prepare and ask for an order of protection in court that same day. We also provide representation in order of protection cases for the entire case. Then we have a separate extended services division where we provide family law, immigration, and assistance with economic issues for survivors of domestic violence. And they'll also have a family defense unit working with families involved in the child welfare system. One of our goals is to provide holistic legal advocacy. So a lot of times our clients are served by various programs. We assist someone with an order of protection and then also help them get their locks changed and maybe eventually file a divorce case. We all try to work together and also have some level of links to resources and supportive services. That is just my agency. There are a number of legal aid organizations providing free or low cost legal services, and domestic violence tends to be a priority area. And then finally, the state's attorney's office, and we'll provide the number for their victim witness staff, assist with pursuing criminal charges in domestic violence situations. And often the state's attorney can assist somebody who is filing criminal charges with getting a protective order right in that same case. So it doesn't necessarily have to be two separate processes. And now Renata's gonna talk a little bit more about the other side, the advocacy resources.
Yes. And I'll talk about the resources that have always been available, and then we'll talk a little bit about how they've been adapted during COVID. But I supervise an incredibly dynamic team of 6 bilingual, dedicated, hardworking court advocates. And typically we work out of the domestic violence courthouse at 555 West Harrison. And that's where my advocates connect with the survivors that come to the court looking for intervention, either through the criminal process or through the civil process. So some of the services Danielle mentioned that advocates can provide include telephone counseling, crisis management, connection to long-term domestic violence counseling, safety planning or safer planning, like we have been saying as of late, because it's difficult to really make things safe, but we can try to make them safer. Connection to emergency resources, like we talked about, and Representative LaPointe mentioned earlier, with respect to emergency transportation and shelter, emergency funds, connection to legal aid resources, like the services that Ascend Justice offers. Metropolitan Family Services also has a legal aid arm, which is the Legal Aid Society, that provides similar services for housing law and family law, and assistance with orders of protections and civil no contact orders, stalking no contact orders, human trafficking. And they also have a unique program called the Safe Families Program, which assists complaining witnesses who have children in common with their abuser in obtaining orders of protection in conjunction with criminal cases, which is a really unique resource for survivors, because they're able to have an attorney representing their interests in conjunction with a criminal case. So in addition to connections to legal aid resources, we can also connect individuals to local advocacy agencies. So we work out of 555, but we can assist folks that might be going to the Daly Center. But there are other organizations that specialize in the suburban Cook courthouses as well as in Collier counties. And Metropolitan Family Services has domestic violence services available in DuPage County as well, and we can provide those numbers. And I think one of the most valuable services I think that an advocate can provide is helping a victim navigate the criminal and civil justice systems. They can support them through the process, and just having someone who can explain the complexity and the options that are available to them, and to sit down and to prioritize what they need, I think is probably one of the most valuable offers that an advocate can make. And Metropolitan Family Services and other agencies as well are also offering a virtual supervised visitation currently for folks that have that ordered through a parentage case or an order of protection case or a divorce case. And domestic violence counseling is still available, and also available through remote options. Let's see. And then if we're ready to move on, Danielle, should we move on to the impact? Or is there anything you wanted to add?
No, I think talking about COVID-19 and how we've had to modify our services is really important.
Yes. So just in terms of the impact that COVID-19 has had on domestic violence, as Danielle mentioned, domestic violence is about power and control, and perpetrators are feeling an increased loss of control. And during COVID, and not just during COVID, but during the unrest and everything else the challenges that we're faced with in our society right now, in our communities right now. And in a lot of ways, I think that some of that loss of control is being compensated by increasing their control at home. So COVID has added a layer of complexity to already complex domestic violence dynamics. And so in terms of those dynamics and the tensions that we talk about, there are a lot of external tensions that are mounting right now. And so when Daniela talked about the cycle of violence, and there's the explosive phase, and then there's the reconciliation phase, and then there is the tension building phase. And so for folks that are in the tension building phase right now, things are really exacerbated. So domestic violence is already a volatile situation, and it's only likely to escalate in frequency and severity during a time like this. So we're all experiencing the stress and fear that's inherent in the pandemic, but I think that's magnified for folks that are living with their abusers. And even if they're not living with their abusers, if they have to co-parent with their abusers or otherwise communicate with their abusers, there's financial stress. There's the fear of loss of employment or actual loss of employment. And sometimes with that loss of employment comes loss of health insurance. There's loss of financial independence. So a survivor that under normal circumstances may have financial independence, which is really important for her to be able to leave and transition out of an unhealthy relationship. She may not have that now. There's a lack of space and privacy. There's no freedom of movement. There's an increased responsibility for, and the stress of having children at home all the time. And there are no healthy outlets for unhealthy emotions in a lot of these situations. Both victims and perpetrators might be disconnected from their support systems that they otherwise rely on. So a survivor might be accustomed to weekly in-person counseling with her counselor, or and that's not available anymore. And telephone and video counseling may not be a possibility because she lives with her perpetrator and doesn't have the privacy to do that from home. She may not be allowed to leave the home, or only is allowed to leave under certain circumstances. And even perpetrators who otherwise might be able to make a choice when they feel like tensions are escalating to stay with family or friends, or to participate in a partner abuse intervention program. Those options might not be available. And so everyone's coping mechanisms, I think, are reduced. And then in addition to that, as these tensions are mounting, safety planning options are limited by social distancing. So no one can stay at a friend's or send kids to the grandparents. There's a fear of contracting viruses at a shelter or a hotel. Survivors might be reluctant to call the police. If a perpetrator is arrested, they'll likely be released within a day or a few days. And so there's a pretty good risk of contracting COVID while in jail. And if he has nowhere else to go and nowhere else to live, he may bring that COVID back to the family and to the children and to the victim, which could only make matters worse and more challenging for everyone at home. And I think something also that we talk a lot about how this has really highlighted all the inequities in our society on so many levels, but especially for undocumented immigrants with language barriers, folks that are unsure of what relief they're eligible for, or for them obtaining remote access is much more difficult if they don't speak English, especially if they don't speak one of the more common languages that like Polish or Spanish, where you might be able to get an interpreter through court on the same day. If it's a more exotic language, you might have to wait days to access those services. And then children are at an increased risk of exposure to abuse, either as victims themselves or as witnesses to the abuse. And there's less eyes, right? There's less eyes on the kids. Kids aren't going to school. They're not talking to their social workers. They're not reporting things to their teachers. Teachers aren't seeing things. And so I think in some cases, what we've seen is that perpetrators are taking advantage of and exploiting some of these impacts of COVID. So exploiting the inherent fear, the uncertainty, the feelings of hopelessness, manipulating victims into staying or otherwise obliging, threatening that they won't be able to return if they leave because they've been exposed, or telling them that they can leave but they can't bring their children because it's bad parenting to expose children to COVID. And Danielle mentioned something really important during the DV 101 piece. You know, it is rare that someone gets punched on a first date, and that's because it takes time for an abuser to break down their victim and to make them feel lesser than. And it is so much easier to manipulate them in situations like this once they feel hopeless and helpless and like no one else may want them, or they have nowhere else to go, or they've been isolated from their support systems. And their self-esteem is down because it's so much easier to control someone when they've been made to feel that way. So I also unfortunately fear that perpetrators might be less cautious about the severity of the abuse that's being perpetrated. So a perpetrator who normally might be very conscientious about the visibility of the abuse or the bruises that are left realizes now that people are staying at home. There's really less of a chance that someone's going to see those injuries before they heal. And survivors are also reluctant to visit an ER for fear of contracting COVID-19. And so there's that, you know, that window between injuries that are so severe that you have to go to the ER, and there's a gap there, I think, of injuries that someone could unfortunately live with at home, and no one ever knows about them or sees them. And navigating the justice system is complicated outside of a pandemic, but now survivors are less likely to know what to expect. And so this has been one of the biggest challenges, I think. Familiar paths to safety and justice have changed. Protocols, hours of operations, phone numbers, processes are different. For service providers, getting information out to the public is challenging, and getting it out there quickly is even more challenging. And one of the many reasons that I felt throughout this whole pandemic that the network advocating against domestic violence, which is operating the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline, has been such a beacon in the storm, is that it's a well-known number that hasn't changed. They've done a fantastic job of staying current on available resources. And they have seen record highs in daily calls. They've seen a 2,000% increase in text messages. And it may be the only safe way that a survivor can communicate while trapped at home with their abuser, through text. So I think right now is a time to just really ask survivors what they need versus saying, here's how this works, but what do you need right now? How can we help you? What are your individual circumstances? And sometimes that means finding creative solutions for safety while in the home. A lot of survivors are placating their abusers and mitigating the abuse. If they're able to confide in a trusted family member, or even a child that's old enough, or a friend or a neighbor, to create a code word when they need immediate help. And a lot of folks are slowly planning their departure, saving money, doing what they can to prepare until it's actually safe and practical to leave. So I think what we've seen recently with all of the automatic extensions and postponements of a lot of the court cases that are still pending is that some survivors are really content with the status quo, especially in a situation, say, where an abuser or an abusive father's visitation has been indefinitely suspended. So the survivor is happy with that, and they're fine, and they don't mind all these automatic extensions. But other survivors are frustrated by the delays because they need resolution, and postponement of all these cases can loom over them, and it's a heavy emotional weight. And then just recently, I would say, with respect to as COVID restrictions the COVID restrictions slightly lifted, we were seeing more people coming forward and coming to the courthouse for assistance, and the helpline was getting more calls from the courthouse rather than from folks at home. But with the most recent injustices and resulting civil unrest and the curfews, victims might be more reluctant to leave their homes again. And getting to court has been challenging, and there's a curfew and the roads are blocked and the CTA isn't operating. So along with COVID, there's other reasons why I feel like there's an increased need for this remote advocacy and hearing options.
Yeah, and I just want to add, we're going to move into talking about what changes we've made and our services in a minute. But a few things that we've seen in the current setup at Ascend Justice is we've been receiving significantly more calls from individuals who are elderly or are disabled and have mobility issues than we usually do. And some of those situations may be exacerbated by COVID. Some of them may just be individuals that we never had the opportunity to hear from before, which is possibly more scary. Renata mentioned issues involving kids in common, but additional concerns about parenting with an abuser during COVID, that they might be endangering the kids, that they might be using threats and trying to take advantage of the situation to gain additional visitation, but again, not in the way that someone would normally do so. So what have we done, right? How does the domestic violence community respond to this? And one of the things that Ascend Justice has been involved in with some of our partners in the court is creating a remote system to seek orders of protection. So normally someone needs to physically come into court, file paperwork, and physically appear in a courtroom to ask for an emergency order of protection. And one thing that, so obviously sending a bunch of people to a courthouse is problematic right now because of social distancing requirements. Normally at 555 West Harrison, and there's, I think the average is 50 or 60 new people walking the door each day seeking resources, but it can be as high as 100 in the summer months. And then there's our staff and Renata's staff and other organizations and the state's attorney and the public defender. And so it's very, very crowded, and that's just not a safe situation right now. And so we were working with trying to figure out how to provide the services that we usually do during this pandemic. And so we worked with the court and came up with a way to provide completely remote services for orders of protection. And so we operate a hotline where individuals can call us. Either one of our staff members or a volunteer attorney will work with them, prepare and have them review the paperwork and email it in. And then we will assist with facilitating a remote hearing. The hearing can either be over Zoom or over the phone, and a judge will hear their case usually that same day or the following morning, and they'll have a chance to ask for an emergency order. And if the judge grants an emergency order of protection, it is an email to them. This, I cannot express what a huge both endeavor, but also step this has been. The legal system traditionally moves really slowly. We're not early adopters when it comes to new technology. So it took a lot of advocacy and work to come up with something that everyone could sort of agree on as a way to do this. I mentioned we've been receiving calls from elderly clients, individuals who are at high risk for contracting COVID, pregnant women, people with young children at home who don't want to bring them to the courthouse. And we've been able to provide services so that they're able to obtain an order of protection without ever leaving their homes. One more thing I'd like to add is, so this is not a perfect system. There definitely have been bumps in the road, but we continue to be able to provide these services. There also is, the courthouse is still open at 555 West Harrison to handle walk-ins. So if somebody needs to leave the house to leave an abusive relationship, they can still go in, and there is social distancing, and things are set up to be as contactless as possible. However, it still is an endeavor. And then Renata, do you want to?
Yeah, no, that's great. And I was just going to add that even though the childcare room that's typically operating at 555 is not open at this time, people are able to bring their children if that's the only option that they have and they don't have childcare at home. But I think one of the things also that makes it challenging is folks have to get on public transportation in a lot of circumstances to get to the courthouse. And so aside from what's happening with the civil unrest and whatnot, you know, you are exposing yourself every time you get on public transportation. But yes, it's been a privilege to work with the group of practitioners that Danielle and I have been working with and advocating with the court system to allow for these remote options. And my advocacy program provides services much like the services that Ascend Justice provides, but we're not attorneys, we're court advocates. They can help with the order of protection process. They can connect them to an attorney if it's necessary. But when social distancing went into effect, we realized that, you know, we lost our connection to clients because we always connected with them at 555. And so my program collaborated with two other exceptional advocacy programs, agencies, Family Rescue and Sarah's Inn. And we created a legal advocacy helpline, trying to streamline the way in which we can get referrals from our community partners, and also just to make it easier for folks to have one number to call to be connected. And so there's one phone number which we'll share along with the resources. And through that one phone number, folks are able to reach advocates from the 3 different agencies. And our service hours include evenings and weekends. Helpline staff can use the language line if somebody has a language barrier. And we have shared that number now with all of our traditional referral sources, which includes the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline, the state's attorney's office, the police, the court, legal aid agencies, DCFS, other DV agencies, and the social media. And I am proud to say, again, the dedicated staff that works this helpline is incredible. And to date, the helpline has answered over 400 calls since late April.
Yeah. And then I just want to add that there are additional resources. So there is another legal aid organization, Legal Aid Chicago, also set up a hotline, and we try to split things between our agency and theirs so that their focus is on assisting individuals who actually show up at 555 West Harrison but need assistance. And they have volunteers who prepare paperwork over the phone and send it in, but just don't do the remote hearing part. And they may also be focusing more on some of the suburban courthouses that are in Cook County, as well as individuals who are filing in family law matters. So we've tried to, as Renata mentioned, this great group of organizations where we have tried our hardest to collaborate and to not duplicate resources, but support each other and refer to each other and just provide a safety net in these really difficult times. One other number we'll be sharing is the state's attorney's office has set up a remote way for individuals who want to pursue charges and want to have their case screened by a state's attorney to call and speak with some of their victim witness staff as well. So that's another agency that is working on trying to increase safety for everyone by not having survivors and staff members, to be honest, have to come into the courthouse in the volume that they had previously done.
Thank you both so much. I want to shift to some questions because we've gotten a few. I will just say, kind of on a personal note, there are 2 things that you said, Renata, that just really stuck in my head. One is that everybody's coping mechanisms are just severely reduced, which makes this issue even more acute and dangerous. And that goes for survivors, but also perpetrators in terms of their coping mechanism. And then also when you mentioned that when people reach out by text message, that has increased by 2,000%. That is really mind-blowing. Also to know that text message is a form that victims can use is exceptional, because as we all know, we all text. It's something you can do to communicate in sort of a surreptitious way, which is obviously important for safety. So we have a few questions that have come in. One, here's one, and it's definitely from somebody who lives in Portage Park. So, and I think geography is important because sometimes the resources you go to are different depending on where you are. So this person is asking, how do we help neighbors when we suspect they are suffering from domestic violence? And then also, how do we help our neighbors prevent domestic violence? It's a pretty big question.
So I think I can address the first question, which is how do we help? And this is a little difficult because, and one thing Renata and I haven't talked about, but we really try at our agencies to center the survivor and have them be the one making the decisions, and to acknowledge that they are the individuals who are experiencing this, and they're in the place to make the best decisions about what increases their safety. And so to really credit that and have us play a supportive role in whatever way we're going to, but to have them be guiding us about what choices they want to make. So that I preface what I'm going to say with that, because it could be that somebody has decided, or at least right now, that the safest thing for them to do is to stay in this relationship, or that's the only option. So with that in mind, though, first of all, keep your eyes and ears open. I would lean towards not hesitating if you feel like a situation is escalating and something sounds very violent, to call the police. I think that traditionally, there's always, there's some danger no matter what, but traditionally people have sort of seen it as not their space, and it may be a situation that is very dangerous and that the victim wants to but can't get assistance. The other thing is, I think letting them know that you're there to help, and that you're available. Renata had mentioned like using a code word. There's apps that have been created for this purpose, to send a message to someone very specific. So like if you see, me pull back this curtain on the second floor, that means things are serious, call the police, is a great way to partner with the victim of abuse. And so to let them be the guide, but also to provide help. I'm sure Renata has some suggestions. In terms of stopping domestic violence, I feel like that is a way, way more complicated issue, because domestic violence is learned, and some of it is seeing domestic violence in the home. Some of it is seeing other forms of violence, not intervening when kids and teenagers are starting to exhibit controlling behaviors. There's societal potential things that can contribute. I'm sort of at a loss to say how we stop domestic violence. Renata?
Can I jump in for a second real quick? And I don't have an answer, but maybe what I can do is offer a question that might help us at least navigate to an answer. So when we talked about earlier, and you all were rotating with your presentations, you talked about domestic abuse and it not being just physical, but we didn't really talk about in great detail what that word means in terms of, we talked about the abuse word, we didn't talk about the domestic word. And I think that's an important understanding here, because when I was working as a prosecutor, we tend to think of domestic abuse. The first image that comes to mind is the abusive husband beating his wife, right? And as we know that in certain cases, it can be the reverse, right? There are cases where the man is the victim in an abusive relationship. Of course, we have same-sex abuse relationships. We have abuses of parents abusing their children. We have abuses of children abusing their parents. And certainly you talked about elder abuse, but when we talk about this and you talk about developing, there are many instances where a domestic abuse starts in early dating relationships, when kids are in their young and middle teens. Absolutely. And they're having that very first romantic relationship. The patterns of abuse start to surface. As you said, it's a learned behavior. the abuser doesn't know that he's abusing or she's abusing. It's just a learned behavior, and they begin to practice it in that first relationship.
Right.
Same thing with the victim. They're learning their role in this process, as horrible as that sounds. But so when we talk about how do you, again, it's a very, very big question. How do we do this? But I think, and this is going to go back to something that Lindsay feels very passionate about, which is mental health. I think so much of this is tied together, and so much that I've learned about solving mental health is removing the stigma. And right now, I think that at least I can admittedly a long time ago that I was a domestic violence prosecutor, but when I did, our typical routine was a case would come into the court, we would identify the survivor, victim, whatever we're calling it. At the time we called them the victim. We would identify them and we would bring them back into a room, and you could just, more often than not, my days were filled with survivors of domestic violence getting it all off their chest, sharing all of these horrible experiences and letting it go. And you can see this relief because they had held so much up, pent in, not able to share these experiences with someone. So I wonder if, and sorry, it's a long way to get to this question, but I wonder if there isn't a parallel to removing the stigma of domestic violence. I mean, it is something that so many people face in their lives, so many varying different degrees across all cultures. And if we can remove that stigma, then people might feel more free to address it, identify that they may be stuck in that relationship, and get some help.
Yeah, no, and that's great. I think that is absolutely true. And that's one of the things that we try to do when we speak about it, and why we talk about how it impacts so many people. And as you mentioned as well, Senator Martwick, it crosses all barriers. Yeah, I think that is, and something else you mentioned, early intervention is key, and some agencies are doing some really great work with students and talking about abuse in relationships at a very early age and what makes a safe relationship. And I think that you hit the nail on the head there. If there is a way out, it's with education and intervening in junior high kids when maybe these controlling behaviors are just starting to make their way.
And I think that's especially true for kids that are growing up witnessing abuse, where that's normalized as a method of conflict resolution. But Senator Martwick, you're right. I mean, domestic violence is the only crime in which the perpetrator continues to return to the scene of the crime over and over again. And Danielle, I couldn't agree with you more. All the points that you made were the points that I would have made as well. There is no one size fits all solution. It is all about safety first. It's all about self-determination for the victim, about empowerment for the victim. And I think, just in terms of preventing or somehow mitigating the abuse, sometimes just your presence, the visibility that people are watching, that there are witnesses, that someone cares, that someone is willing to check in. Sometimes that's enough to deter. But I think it's also really important to consider how careful we need to be when we make a decision to intervene, because if it backfires, it's not going to necessarily backfire on us, most likely the intervener. It's most likely to backfire on the survivor. And so we really just, I think, need to ask, how can we support you? Check in and say that I'm here, I believe you, and this is not okay. And you dictate what I can do to help you if there's anything I can do. And then just wait and hope. And like you said, if you do see something that is escalating to a level of severity that requires immediate intervention, then I think that's important as well.
Yeah,
Renata, that was you brought up, I'm sorry, there's so much of this that's like stirring up memories of my time serving in this field. And you talk about that intervention and being careful about how we intervene and the manner that we intervene. When I was a state's attorney, our job obviously was, it wasn't unidimensional, but it's certainly more unidimensional than your jobs, right? Your jobs were far more dynamic. Our job was to prosecute. But I saw that where in times where we were required to make decisions about the intervention that we were going to make where they did backfire, right? I saw very, I'm not sure how to describe this, but I saw survivors who at a point seemed like they were really ready for help in breaking out of their cycle of violence, and then our intervention caused them to turtle back into that. And so those were difficult decisions, and I saw the downside of it. Maybe this is an opportunity to talk about, because I think we kind of brushed over it quickly, the difference between when someone is ready for that help and they reach out to the legal system. We mentioned that there were two choices, right? They could obtain a civil order of protection legally, or they could reach out and have to the state's attorney's office and seek the filing of criminal charges. Can we go over a little bit about what the differences are? Again, this is something that is far enough in my past that I wouldn't be ready to describe it. But Danielle, you're there. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the effective difference of what an order of protection does for you and what seeking criminal charges does.
Of course, yeah. And I apologize for glossing over it. There was so much to cover, and so a civil, what I'm referring to as a civil order of protection is when someone comes into civil court, says, I need protection from this other person, and here's why. And the court has the ability to enter an order of, and there are several types of protective orders, but we're talking about domestic violence. So we're talking about an order of protection. And the court can grant an order saying a variety of different things. Most often we're talking about an order that says to the abuser, you can't contact me, you can't come to this residence, you can't come to these addresses. There's the ability, if there are kids in common, for the court to order or reserve or deny visitation or set up a safe visitation, as Renata mentioned, and do a variety of different things. Prohibit the posting of explicit photos or videos, order repayment for damage to property. And so the court has really broad powers. And
can they also at least I remember they could order the I'm not sure, the respondent in the order of protection, is that the right word? To have to turn over any firearms or weapons, right? So which is another way of providing some safety and security for the person who's afraid, right?
Absolutely. And even in an emergency order of protection, because of the way in Illinois our FOID Act is written, somebody who is, their FOID card should be revoked, and if any order of protection is issued against them, even an emergency order, so they lose the right temporarily, only temporarily, but to legally own weapons while that is in effect. And that is a safety feature. And the purpose of getting the order of protection is because it is enforced by the police, and there's the possibility of charges being filed for violation of that order of protection. That's a separate criminal charge. So if the abuser knows about this order and then goes ahead and violates it, even by doing something as just normal as coming to the victim's house and ringing the doorbell, that is something that can lead to criminal charges for violating that order of protection. And the idea is to take criminal things, but also non-criminal things, and make them criminal because of the history of abuse, recognizing the power and control that the abuser may have over the survivor. With criminal charges, the intent is different. And so we're talking about a specific incident, a crime that has been committed, that the police investigate, the state's attorney can pursue criminal charges against that abuser for, and have them charged and potentially convicted and face some sort of sentence as a result of the incident of abuse. So it involves different individuals, and the purpose of it is to prosecute a crime, right? A crime has been committed, to treat it that way. and to have some sort of sentence. I mentioned that it's possible to get a protective order, which does the same thing as a civil order of protection in that case. So you can do both things. It also does allow for sentences that include a variety of things. So sometimes we are talking about jail time. Sometimes we're talking about community service. PAPE, which is a partner abuse intervention program, which is specifically is designed to assist abusers. So there are, there are two different avenues that are achieving two different things. And we're speaking with clients. Sometimes somebody is at a stage where they want an order of protection. They want to separate from the abuser, but they want to sort of they don't want to pursue charges. And then there are times where we speak with someone and they're at the point where they want, a crime has been committed, they want the abuser to be prosecuted, but possibly also have that protection.
And am I correct in my memory too, that upon the issuance of an order of protection, that order goes into a database so that in the event that person who the order has been issued against decides to break their order of protection, when the survivor calls the police, it pops up, there's an order of protection in place, and it gives them a heightened sense of we should get there. Not that it is going to, but it is creating a heightened sense of awareness amongst law enforcement that there is a domestic problem here, right?
Absolutely. So it leads the law enforcement something data system. I forget what the A stands for, but yes. And so orders of protection go into leads. That means if someone gets stopped by the police, if a survivor calls the police, they run that person's name and it comes up. And so it can be a tool at getting a quicker response. It sort of flags it as an emergency, as a priority. The other thing is it takes the kind of guessing away from law, it puts law enforcement in a situation where it's very easy for them to enforce the law without having to try to figure out who's really the victim, who's really the perpetrator, what's really going on, because sometimes they'll show up at the scene and you have two people accusing each other of violence. And maybe you have a situation where one person is showing physical injuries because they're scratches, and the other person might have bruises, but they might not be visible yet, or they might never be visible because of skin color and things like that. And so there can be a situation where police show up and really are puzzled at what to do, and having a protective order makes it abundantly clear. One person's supposed to be here, the other person's not. It's I think it's helpful.
And the other thing that I remember from my time too was that prosecuting a domestic violence case it involves providing evidence, as it should in every criminal case, that beyond a reasonable doubt that this domestic violence incident happened. With the order of protection, when you are in that stage either before or maybe after some minor violence, as you said, where the survivor is not ready to pursue the criminal avenue, but what it does is once the order of protection is in place, simply violating the order in and of itself is a crime. Exactly. So it heightens the sense of, again, if the order of protection is typically like you need to stay away, simply violating that order by approaching that person or coming to the house or whatever it is a crime in and of itself. You've violated the order.
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes that's a step that survivor wants to take. The other thing that we haven't talked about, but I think it's important to mention, is that the court has the power in an order of protection case to enter an emergency order that takes effect immediately and protects them, and then is served on the other person. And so then there's a chance to come into court to ask for a longer order of protection. And part of why that is so important is because that person can then get the help of local law enforcement and be able to have the abuser sometimes removed from the home immediately, to get belongings immediately, to prohibit to return children that have been taken and maybe in an unsafe situation, to prevent the abuser from coming to a school or daycare by providing them with that order. So this is it. And I mentioned that law, we're not early adopters. Typically the legal system does not move that quickly. So it is to be able to come in and order right now over the phone and email and get an emergency order is a huge way in which the legal system can move very, very quickly. It's an exception. Yeah, definitely.
Got it. I'm going to squeeze in 2 more questions.
Sure.
And then we'll wrap up. This is amazing. We could talk for a long time, and we'll try to capture any stray questions and we can just answer them in writing on Facebook. So I actually, one of my old coworkers who's based in Decatur, who is a professor at Millikan University, actually in criminology, was watching, and she had, well, we'll do 3 more questions because she has 2 questions, and then I have a question I want to close with. She is wondering, do you work at all with a family violence coordinating council? Because that isn't something that they have down in Macon County, where Decatur is located. No, if you've never heard of it, then we probably don't work with it.
Maybe we have a different name for it.
Yep. Okay. And then her other question is about, for anybody, and Rob, this would be based on your experience in the prosecutor's office. Does the state's attorney keep data on what kinds of cases are coming through the system in terms of, is it the variations on intimate partner violence, like sibling, intimate partner, does the state's attorney keep that data and look at it so then we can adapt our service system response depending on what kind of cases are actually coming through the system?
Well, I would leave that to Danielle to answer. It's been 20 years since I've been in a domestic violence courtroom, so she probably knows better what they're doing in terms of data collection these days.
Yeah, so thank you, Senator Amar. Yes, the state's attorney does keep data. The court also captures data. And when someone comes in the courthouse, the city, the network, as Renata mentioned, through the DV helpline. So there are a lot of sources for data and things like that. I would say that overall, the vast majority of clients that we serve are experiencing domestic violence in an intimate partner relationship. However, during COVID, the calls to our remote hotline have been a little bit different. So we've seen a higher number, and I don't know if Renata, if you share this as well, but a higher number of non-intimate partner relationships. What it could involve, for example, an elderly family member who had a family member move in due to COVID, or move, or a situation where someone's living in the home has escalated, partially because everyone is stuck in the home. I don't know, Renata, if you've seen that, but that's something we've noticed. But generally speaking, I would say no, it's intimate partner hugely.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I can't say that I've seen a huge increase in those non-intimate partner violence cases, but we've definitely seen a few. I'm just looking at our data for those 400 calls, and the stalking no contact orders, represent a really small percentage of those. And with respect to the orders of protection, there was a few that were caregiver relationships. But I think we're still primarily seeing the intimate partner violence.
Got it. Excellent. Thank you. So here's a question I'd like to close with, and that is, from your perspective on the ground, working very hard on this issue, what's your message to elected officials in terms of what can elected officials do to help with this issue of domestic violence? And I'm really asking from a place of, yes, we are elected officials that work at specific levels of government, like the state house or city council or the county, but we're also just leaders in the community that have platforms to raise awareness about different issues. So when I ask that question, I'm kind of asking broadly, what do you need from elected officials to really make more progress on this issue and keep people safe and accountable?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I have a few thoughts. One of them is funding. I think it was Senator Martwick, but you also mentioned it, Representative LaPointe, that funding for domestic violence is one of those things that ends up on the chopping block. Like it seems like every few years, and I think one of the issues is that there isn't. We haven't solved domestic violence. We haven't ended domestic violence. And so while I think funding is hugely important, it's important in two areas. And one of them is initiatives to intervene early on, to provide counseling, to provide education for kids with the aim of stopping domestic violence as a community. But there is still a strong need for individual services for domestic violence to help individual survivors out of domestic violence situations. And sometimes I feel like that that need sort of gets downplayed because it's not something new. It's not something, that just sprung up last month or last year, but it is an ongoing issue, and COVID has just made it so much worse. So not letting this fall from, sort of everyone's awareness that this is in funding, but also just normally that this is a huge issue that impacts a tremendously large number of people. The other thing though that I can think of is keeping in mind those connections that we mentioned earlier. So there is a link between gun violence and domestic violence. I've seen tons of criminal histories of respondents in our cases that involve not only domestic violence in their histories, but weapons charges and violent crimes. We see it almost every time there is a large, like a mass shooting incident where there's a history involving domestic violence. So there is a strong link, and that's part of why I think this issue is so important to keep at the forefront. Renata?
And I think that, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. I think that we're in a time when we really need strong leadership at every level, for not only.
Well,
you're on mute.
You went mute.
Renata?
Or maybe she froze.
Offenders accountable, to making sure that we are not, sorry. Can you guys hear me?
Yes,
can,
sorry,
yeah.
there was
Okay.
a moment of, yeah. Oh no. Okay.
Well,
yeah, I think Renata.
I can tell what she was about to say was, she was about to unleash some wisdom. I could just feel it.
Yeah.
But that's okay, because this is an ongoing conversation. We've all just gotten a better orientation to the issue, generated a ton of questions. And I know that for me, in terms of my leadership role, I feel better educated so I can keep the conversation going. We'll see if she wants to pop in and give her words.
I am so sorry.
I'm impressed with your ability to jump back on.
No, so I think, we talked about stigma. We talked about reducing the stigma. I think one of the ways to do that is to emphasize and highlight these connections, to get more people on board and invested in domestic violence, to raise awareness. And again, I think accountability is huge, especially when we talk about, holding our systems accountable, holding our police department accountable. And I'm hopeful. I think I'm really grateful for our local leadership. But I think obviously, there are some issues with our leadership above. And so, the Violence Against Women Act, making sure, we don't lose that. And yeah, I mean, we definitely don't have the resources that we need. I mean, the amount of on a good day, the amount of shelter beds that are available in the city of Chicago are barely enough to cover the
daily calls that the hotline receives on a busy day. So that's a problem.
Yep, absolutely. And I think it's really important to remember that, and the status quo, in which we were able to hold the status quo in the state budget in terms of state funding for domestic violence this year, but the status quo is the status quo, and it's not what we need. So as elected officials and leaders, we need to constantly be working towards how we can improve the system overall. All right. Well, we definitely went over because this is such an important issue and people have a lot to say. So thank you all so much. Rob, Danielle, Renata, thank you for your time. And I'm so glad that this conversation will be archived so people can tune in at their leisure. And hopefully we'll be doing more of these discussions.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so
And
much.
thank you
Everybody
both for your
stay safe.
leadership.
Our
Thank you.
pleasure.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.